There we go. Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Growth Show. I'm delighted to be joined with Tom Pickering and David Berkeley. Today we are exploring fear and everything that encompasses it in a business sense. So Tom, first, what is fear in your eyes?
Yeah, the good news is, Nick, I think it's unreal. So that's quite a reassuring starting place. So what do I mean by that? That said, there are reasons to be fearful as well. I'll just try and explain what I mean. So I think one of the common themes that's coming out of this is that there's a guy called Socrates who said that the more I know, I think the more I realise I know nothing, which I think summarises the COVID situation at the moment. So in theory, that thought of not knowing what to do could be quite fearful. That said, it's a perception, but it's not a reality. And so that's the funny thing about it. And we've got a choice to avoid it and or reject it. I think the challenge with it is, well, first of all, what does sort of good look like? What's the antithesis to fear? I think what good looks like is like a set of intimate relationships within a team that are testing, adjusting, communicating very closely to hit the target, and playing music that people want to hear, as opposed to the old tune, whatever that was. So that's a very sort of free, and yet it's coordinated. It's very guided as well in a very natural sort of way. I think on the flip side, what does bad look like? I think when people do become fearful, they do actually or choose to be fearful. It switches off thinking, and that puts us into a mode called fight or flight, which people have probably heard of before. And what happens then is a bit worrying. People start making statements like, "You don't understand me," and communication drops off, and people become very responsive to negative things, which is a bit worrying. And they sort of get a life of its own, and then analysis then suffers, which creates this sort of self-fueling situation. And in that situation, people and organisations become very prone to distractions, negative distractions of all kinds of different types, some of which sound quite positive, but in fact are quite flawed. And some of the antidotes to that, in its simplest form, is sort of to recognise what sort of creatures we are. We're fairly primitive, and there was a time on this earth when things used to eat us. And so if something wasn't like us, in terms of shape or size, there's a good chance it might be a threat. And so there's a real need from a practical perspective to develop rapport. I think as well, there's a common theme which I'm picking up, which is humour. And humour, actually, if you in particular, without being flippant, if there's somebody you disagree with, if you can get them to laugh, I think what that does is to level people's assumptions and creates quite a clean sheet of paper to start from, and engage in relatively productive dialogue. So I think that would be my description of fear, and what does good look like and what does not so good look like. But the good news is, I think actually it's unreal. So we have a choice.
Perfect. I'll take unreal. And David, you must encounter this all the time with your clients and your coaching. Have you got any way to sort of overcome fear?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a good few strategies that we can employ here, and I'll share them. I think one of the things is Tom talks about flight or fight. And there's also a third one that we don't talk about, which is often freeze. We've all had that situation where in the middle of the night, you wake up, you hear like a sound in the flat or the house, and you think, "Oh my word, am I being burgled?" Most people don't jump out of bed looking for a fight or try and jump out the window to escape. Most people just freeze in bed and hope that it isn't what they think it is. And I think that often happens in business as well, is that people just freeze. They don't know what to do, so they don't do anything. Fighting fight or flight requires some action. You're either going to run away from it, but at least you're running, you're creating some sort of movement you can then channel into something more positive. But the freezing bit is a bigger worry. One of my favourite quotes around fear is from the great Steven Seagal. And if you're of a certain generation like those action films, this is a brilliant one. And I can't remember which film it is in, but the quote is, "The anticipation of death is usually a lot worse than the actual thing." And so much of the things that I witness and people getting fearful about are things that the percentage chance of it happening are very, very low. But the amount of time we spend worrying about it, and I include myself in this more than anybody else, is enormous. And that doesn't add anything. And so the two top tips that I give, and usually clients are doing the first one, is one, just to talk about it with somebody. You know, a problem shared is actually often a problem, you know, halved. And find somebody, a really good friend of mine said, in life, David, find people who've been in deep water in life. Find people who've gone through some crap, to put it bluntly, because they'll usually give you far better advice than people who've only ever paddled in the shallow end. So find people who've been in deep water and they'll usually give you some really good advice. And actually, a lot of the fear goes as you talk it through with somebody. That's a lot of what I do with my clients, is we actually talk about it and get to the root of what people are really worried about. Another great exercise, that if you're really bold, you can do this on your own, is set a timer for 2 minutes and focus on the worst case scenario for 2 minutes. And just focus on that. The brain finds it phenomenally uncomfortable. Usually after about 30 seconds, if you see people doing it, they're sort of fighting with their sort of, you know, the face starts doing this as they're fighting to kind of really stay engaged with it. But after 2 minutes, your brain starts to actually rationalize it and actually goes, okay, well, the worst case scenario is I lose my business. Okay, well, I can get a job and then I'll rebuild. Okay, that's not, you know, I'm not going to be living on the streets. And actually your brain starts to problem solve with it. The biggest problem is we spend so much time looking at all the things around the fear that we're worried about, but not the actual thing. And so just spend some time sitting with that fear and it will shift it.
Oh, I think that's brilliant. I mean, brilliant. And Tom, you obviously come in the turnaround industry, come into numerous businesses who will be fearful of you, I guess, from not knowing who you are and what's going to go on. How do you sort of counter those sort of fears in the early stages?
Yeah, well, humour. I think, I think it's very important to be approachable, Nick. So I think but it's also important, I think, to acknowledge the environment as well. So I think, in its simplest form, the easiest way to overcome fear is just to make yourself approachable. Make time for people, put other people first, care about people. And that's a sort of internal thing. I think though as well, in terms of what David said, I think it's absolutely critical to really understand what difficult situations look like. And I think in these situations, people can become, David just said about, not taking action, I was talking really about the sort of the fear state. I think David's absolutely right but it's the stasis that's deadly, because that in itself can create a habit. So there's an environmental issue with that in terms of organizations. And people are waiting for things to happen. So, and one of the themes we're picking up is expecting certainty when it's unlikely to happen. So you can wait as long as you like for that. And so I think the other thing is that a lot of decisions have been planned in the good old days. I think a lot of businesses have done their budgeting processes and planned decisions. And actually now there's a real need to take action on a daily basis. And it's not the same old stuff. It's actually new action. And one of the things we're picking up very strongly in our pub calls every week, because we're checking this with all kinds of interesting people, including yourself, Nick, actually, where we're trying to make sense of this current environment where, in terms of actually really what's going on. And people really don't understand what new action is at all, and actually what's stopping them from taking new action. So I think the more this goes on, the more entrenched it becomes. And I think from a practical perspective as well, people don't realise how important relationships are. So I don't know if you watched the Formula One, but there was an unusual number of breakdowns on the Formula One and reliability issues. And I don't think that's by chance, because it's absolutely critical in terms of fixing problems. That David talked about relationships and talking to people. I'd make that into sort of dynamic state. We're always looking out for each other, because that's the way the human race has frankly survived for such a long period of time. I think the other danger of this is that in a fearful situation, people could become overconfident and actually enjoy the experience, which is a bit worrying. And I picked this up in a turnaround situation where you've got people who sort of like to hunker down and think this is great, when in fact it's really not. And I think people then start talking about pessimism versus optimism, whereas, as David said, realism, which is actually getting to the facts. And in terms of what you just described, David, I think it's about asking difficult questions, and that's quite difficult. So you're then faced with actually having to ask a question in a difficult situation, which actually requires courage. And so I'm normally the person that starts that process and makes that okay. I think there's the other thing, we ran a survey, so there's another interesting thing, which people don't know what to do and yet don't need any help, which is an interesting one. And people often don't recognise that they are fearful, yet some people reckon they know how to address it, which is a bit odd as well. So there's a huge amount of sort of lack of awareness of ourselves, what drives us. One thing's for sure, though, in this current climate, whether we like it or not, that there is about 3 months to fix this, because at the end of October, this supported situation from the government is going to turn out one way or the other. And even the most experienced people who operate in my sort of environment, in turnaround environment, investors are quite lucky because they don't have to, they can invest when things actually fall into pieces and pick up the pieces, which is a different world. But people who are actually running businesses, well, investors have also got portfolios, but within the portfolio, it's absolutely vital, to prepare the organisation for whatever's coming up in October. And I'm still observing that two things. One is people don't understand what new action is, and secondly, they don't understand what's stopping them from taking new action. So that's two things which we're focusing on at the moment.
Yeah, and David, I've always considered myself someone who's driven by fear. Like the fear of actual failure, letting people down, and I've always assumed people fall into one of two categories of people who are obsessed with sort of winning, and people who sort of fear of failing or letting people down. Is that got any truth to it? Is there one that's better than the other when it comes to a mindset?
Is there one better than the other? No. Because I go with what works. So I prefer to work with someone's natural flow. So if someone's more driven by the fear of failure, to get them to focus on a reward that they're not as motivated by is not going to get as good a result. So all of those things are really good if they're in a positive place. It's something Tom's talked about a lot. It's just being on the edge of your comfort zone, of not necessarily knowing the answers, is a really good place to be, because it usually brings out the best of people, and that's where growth happens. It doesn't happen when you're so out of your comfort zone, you're crippled by, almost paralyzed by fear, and it certainly doesn't happen when you're very, very comfortable. I think in terms of that kind of how people are motivated, I think generally, give or take, about 40% of people are away from motivated, 40% of people are toward motivated, so carrot, stick, that sort of thing. And then 20% sort of sit in the middle that are a bit of both. So you just need to know them. So in terms of your team, if you're driven by fear of failure, not everybody in your team is going to be. And so in terms of managing the team, it's probably just understanding what people's motivators are. Are they going to lose something, or are they going to gain something? And just understanding that, and completely understanding that in yourself. I think where people come into problems is when it's, slips into that unhealthy place where, if you suddenly, Nick, and there's no reason why you would, but if you suddenly couldn't get out of bed because you were so crippled by that fear that you could, lose everything, that's in a really negative place. And that's not going to bring the best out of you or your team. And that's going to, there's a thing called, I think, called transference, where people can sense it in people. And if you get on a conference call with all your team are going to pick up on it, and that's going to affect their behavior. And it becomes like a domino effect through a business, that suddenly everyone's fearful of doing anything. And you're turning around going, but I've got great people. They should be able to cover me when I'm not on the top of my game. And it just spreads through. And so it's just being self-aware enough to know when that's happening and reverse it quickly, and don't jump on a call when that's happening.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point. I think from my personal standpoint, I have people around me who are completely driven by winning, and they can celebrate, finding a penny on the floor, like, and have a massive party about it. And I think using that combination of people around me is really good. Like, because they'll be sat in the pub going, best month ever, wasn't that amazing? That's great. And I'll be there secretly in my pint going, Well, thank God.
Yeah.
Live to fight another day. But I
Yeah.
think being conscious of that was a key part of my growth, for understanding that people can pick up on that sort of vibe, right? You
Yeah.
know, and sort of being open with them about that's what my focus is on, and now we should enjoy ourselves. But also, as a leader, learning to pat yourself on the back every now and then was something that's taken me sort of years to sort of get around the fact that it's not for you, it's for the people around you. Actually, it's like your birthday. People want to celebrate your birthday. I might not want to celebrate it, but actually most of the time it's not for me, it's for the people around who love you and want to be involved. Sorry, very odd analogy.
No, but I think it's really right, and it speaks exactly into that self-awareness. And I think one of your great strengths, Nick, and certainly having spoken to a couple of members of your team, is your self-awareness and knowing what you're good at, and knowing, you know, what other people are really good at, and getting them to do the bits that they're really good at, and you doing the bits that you're really good at. That is, you know, it sounds so obvious in leadership, but it's done so little in my experience, because people just don't have that self-awareness. They think, oh, I can kind of cover things up and people don't really notice. People always notice, they just don't often tell you, because you'll get very British about it. But that's what happens, right? We've all had bosses like that.
Yeah, and I think that leads on to the fear point a little bit more, because a lot of the senior leadership management skill set has been taken away through this period of time. So, for example, you might be a leader who's amazing at hiring, right? Just an absolute inspirational hiring person, and now for the next 3 to 6 months, you ain't hiring, right? And you might have made a career on being able to attract the best talent in business, and now that thing is switched off. And I guess being brave enough to focus on your other skill sets and not feel you have to fill the hole is going to be key right now. Tom, do you have anything to echo around that, or have you seen anything similar to that?
Yeah, I think winning is an interesting one, Nick. That's what I describe as being a mantra, and as a leader, if you mention the word winning, it's a question of the consequences of that. So the two types of, I used to be really competitive on a bike when I'm 26, really used to fly. And there weren't many people, to be honest, that could actually beat me up a hill. And I still got the same mentality, but I know very well now that people can beat me up a hill, and I still don't like it. And sometimes I can chase them, but actually you soon learn, there's always someone that can hit you harder. Always. And business, it's the same thing. So I think winning is an interesting one. And it creates a dynamic as well, which can be quite destructive internally. But so it's a mantra. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. It's just about being a statement. So that's an example of a statement and what the implications of that statement, if leaders make those types of statements. It's not to say it's wrong. It's just because some people will be more. But again, coming back to that jazz band, you need people of different types with different traits to work together. I think if you, so I think there's a couple of things I think are better than actually, if you want to, well, if you put it another way, if you want to win, right, I think there are a few things you can do. So I think a lot of the paradigms are messed up at the moment, and people don't particularly realize it. So the odd thing about winning is actually, if you start putting other people first rather than yourself winning, you're in a really great place, because then it becomes self-fulfilling. This mantra around growth is an absolute destroyer on a number of fronts. So growth in profitability, I think, is a great thing, but growth in revenue and endless growth tends to trash businesses. And it's far more about, for example, appreciating what you've got and focusing on your core business, because one of the implications of this so-called winning tends to trash your core business if you're not careful. You lose sight of what you've got. And this other thing around domination, which I guess is one of the outputs of this so-called winning, actually, again, tends to cause a lot of difficulties. And so I think it's critical to be aware of these paradigms and what's said in organizations. I think it's all about taking new action. So I think it's about having a new set of spectacles to see what's going on and test and adjust and get the best out of people. And also, when someone says something different to you, rather than label them or, with whatever the label might be, is actually to take a really active interest in what they're saying, to acknowledge what they're saying, to appreciate the way they are, even if they are competitive or so-called winners or whatever. Acknowledge them the way they are. Really take time to understand them, and take a perspective from not where you'd like them to be, which is often the sort of perspective that leaders are, but actually that's totally transformational. So I think they're the odd things I think that really actually create winning. Whereas the mantras, I think, can be quite difficult. The challenge then is how do you stay on track? So it's about keeping that team dynamic healthy. So I think there's sort of three things I look at. One is the ability to see the target. So what's the music you're playing? How do you work together? So you've got some winners, you've got some people who are quieter. You need them both. You need that diversity. You need to be able to say what you feel in your own way. And then it's got to be continuous new action. And and the challenge is in the context of fears, what's stopping you from taking that action? And it's a whole raft of silly stuff. It's like making yourself look stupid, fear of criticism, lack of confidence. And some cultures actually, like the public sector, they actually can actively discourage it. So one of the things we've completely avoided, I've got a whole raft of stuff going at the moment, but we're not going to touch the public sector because it's going to be such a drain on our resources that it's just, it's a battle we're not going to fight. And within that, I think as well, there's uncertainty. People are expecting uncertainty. So beware of some of the bear pits, in terms of your budgeting process. Do you really expect to know? And actually, it's more around how are you going to test and adjust on a live basis and organise this jazz band to hit the target. So I think that's what I'd say about winning. It's an interesting one. It's much more about relationships and profit, I think. If you really want to get a business motoring, focus on relationships and profit, then you're getting
totally. And finally, David, bring it back to fear. Some great points earlier on the 2 minutes, and that actually trying to focus on it and realizing that you can't actually sustain that much of the thought around it without sort of rationalizing it in there. Is there anything else you'd pass on to leaders right now about fear, or using it in a positive light, or anything from a negative connotation?
Yeah, as always with these conversations, I always scribble down notes in between things. There's always things pop up, and one of the things that sort of came to me is a lot of the time fear is driven either by past experience. So, I went through a sort of a dip in the economy before, and that's what happened, and that drives our behaviour, negative, positive, whatever it is. Or we become fearful of future events that haven't happened, and we don't know what's going to happen. And often we live between those two places. And the problem is we then don't actually focus on the point between those two places, which is right now. The right now isn't, driven, or shouldn't be driven by what's happened before, previously, because what's happened previously shouldn't have a particular bearing on what is going to happen in the future. And likewise, what's going to happen in the future is driven by our actions now. What's the great phrase? It's something like, life is 10% what happens to us and 90% how we react to it. And I think that's a real thing, is that we either, most of the time, and myself included, we react from a past, something that's happened in the past, or something we're worried about that could happen in the future, but we don't focus on what we can actually do to change either of those perspectives right now. And so I would just really encourage people to come back to, don't worry about what's happened in the past. What's past is past. You can change how you react to it. And don't worry about the future things that haven't happened yet, because you have influence over that. And one of the things we test in the emotional intelligence profile is that personal power, the degree to which you have, the degree to which you have input on your outcomes. And I think a lot of the time, that's something I'd really work on with people, is personal power and emotional resilience. Those two things in dealing with fear are big.
Yeah.
That's what I tried to describe. Sorry.
After you, Tom.
I was going to say, that's why I tried to describe it. I call what David just described fluidity, which is almost like you've got a completely blank mind. How do you get there? It's basically practicing, being comfortable with your peers for a start, not fearful of your peers, because has your boss got the courage to let you do what you need to do? Do you feel comfortable to take new action? Do you feel safe to take new action? That's what I've tried to articulate. So some of the mantras around winning can be quite at the antithesis of that. That's the reason why I made that point. I think the other thing is that we can't do these things ourselves. So a lot of education's around, yes, you can do it yourself. Actually, that's not that, from my experience, isn't reality. But I think the good news is that fear is a perception. It's not real. And we have a choice, Nick. So you can either be fearful or you can be excited and do something about it. That's your choice. The difficulty at the moment is if you leave it too long, you do become fearful, because what that does is it, in my simple analytical perspective, is it decouples your actions and your beliefs, and that creates stress, and you then stop thinking, etc. So it's very important to feel part of that jazz band, play your tune, be appreciated for who you are, continuously taking your action, keeping the music script absolutely blank, which is exactly the way a jazz band is. There are lots of the antithesis of that, lots of organizations being very unaware of the mantras, maybe it's winning, maybe whatever it is that are driving them, and they're playing music that no one wants to hear anymore. That's the problem, I think, and it's vital to break that cycle, the fear cycle, by taking new action.
Yeah, and it reminds me of one of my mentors when I was fairly young, who took every moment you could interpret as fear and just made it exciting.
Yeah,
and made me really conscious of the fact, like, this is going to be great,
Yeah.
And they came from a sporting background, and you see it with professional athletes, right?
Yeah.
I think one of the most insulting questions you can ask an athlete is, were you nervous before your 100 meters, or whatever their event is? And they're like, no, that's literally their job. This is what they sort of live for on the biggest stage at that moment. Go bang, that we're off, we're running, it's fun. And I think that's I think it's really important for anyone who's developing juniors in a business, of finding those moments that could be deemed fearful and actually making them exciting, like getting a new mindset in place for, like, here's a bit of public speaking, we'll have fun with it, we'll stand up, we can say some things, and just program that in, for the challenge, that constant challenge, and getting people who want to seek out that challenge and that sort of that drug, which is really actually sort of taking you on new, nervous, scary experiences. But guys, again, thank you so much for your time, Tom, David. Really good as always. Thanks everyone at home for all the subscribes, all the likes, all the passing on the stuff. It's awesome from you. Thank you so much. If you have a topic you want us to discuss, write in and we'll put it to the expert panel. Otherwise, looking forward to the next one, guys, and we will speak all very soon. All the best. Bye bye.